Welcome back, everybody, to another Oases of Wisdom podcast episode. Today, we're honored to have with us Joshua Little. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So, Dr. Joshua Little is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Department of Arabic Language and Culture at the National Chengchi University. He received a DPhil in Asian and Middle Eastern Studies from the University of Oxford in 2023. Joshua is a fellow Oxonian, just like myself, and we have to point that out every time. And his research focuses on the origins, transmission, and reception of Hadith, the formation of the Quran, and the methods and debates of modern Islamic studies. His recent publications include an article in History Compass, an article in Journal of Islamic Studies, and a forthcoming tripartite series of articles in the Journal of International Quranic Studies Association. So for those of you who know Joshua's work online, you'll know that he did a video with Javad Hashmi on the different reasons why academics are skeptical of Hadith. So today we've brought him on to talk about ways in which we can reconstruct and learn and gain historical kernels and learn some things from the Hadith corpus. Along with that, he's going to share some information on his background. So as we always do, we first like to ask our guest about their background. How did they come into Islamic studies, especially if they're not from a Muslim background themselves? So Joshua, the first things we want to ask you is, how did a countryside-born Aussie, which you told me before, we're both from the state of Victoria in Australia, so how did a guy born in the countryside get into Islamic studies? And more specifically, you've been very open about your former Islamophobic background online. So how did you start off as an Islamophobe and a Zionist as well, you've said? How did you go from an Islamophobe and a Zionist to a Hadith scholar and a lover of Islamic civilization?
That's a good question. And I sometimes ask myself that as well. You know, if I'm sort of at a conference or I'm just, reading through some sort of work of early Hadith criticism, I do sometimes wonder how this happened. Like, how did I end up here? I think actually, I'll tell you what, I'll begin with my earliest memories of anything to do with Islam and then sort of move forward to how I actually started looking into Islam specifically, which was as a teenager, in the sort of the height of sort of the new atheist movement. And then also it was sort of strongly linked, where there was a big overlap with Islamophobia as well. And so I was sort of sucked into that as well, through to then how that sort of shifted. And then I ended up sort of at Oxford. I think probably my earliest memory of anything to do with Islam, it's probably 9/11. But even then, I don't actually remember anything specific. I don't even remember the word Muslim or Islam from that period. I remember someone at school, like a classmate, telling me something about who had done it, but I have no memory. So probably that was actually the first time I sort of heard anything, but I don't remember. So who knows? My first concrete memory of sort of learning anything about Islam is from a world history sort of class from school. I think probably at the end of primary school, and we learned about.
And sorry to interrupt. Was this school?
Yes.
Your school was in the countryside of Victoria. So we're talking.
This is correct. Yes, rural Australia.
So you were learning the first time you heard was history in primary school in rural Australia. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. We were told about Muhammad and sort of the call that he received and his sort of career, just like very, very basic. And at the time, I was some kind of perennialist. I mean, obviously, I didn't have a name for it, so I was kind of like a de facto sort of perennialist. And so I recognized in Muhammad a prophet, another prophet from God, alongside Jesus and probably like the Buddha and these other kinds of figures. And so at that time, I was sort of very sympathetic or favorably disposed, if that makes sense. So initially, I had a very positive view of Islam and of Muhammad. And in fact, I thought he was a prophet, right? Just not in sort of maybe the full Islamic conception, but in that sort of perennialist. But at some point in maybe I think it's between the age of 14 and 16, I started watching like new atheist like lectures and videos and so on YouTube, right? And so this was both sort of the more famous figures, so the sort of debates of, Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens. And that was very appealing. The sort of ideology, certainly, especially at that age, right? If you're sort of like an insecure teenager, something like New Atheism, although it's not the only thing that functions like this, but I think it did function like this. New Atheism is sort of a way that you can feel intellectually sort of superior and confident, right? It's a way for you to sort of lash out and attack and denigrate other people and be rude and to think that this is actually a good thing, that you're doing something noble by being sort of rude and vulgar and trashing people. This is that you're actually defending, and then choose your slogan, Western civilization, the Enlightenment, science and reason, and so on and so forth, right? And so this was very attractive to me at that time, right? And so I became sort of fully absorbed into that. And initially, though, I was not like focused particularly on Islam, right? The primary focus of New Atheism was evangelical or fundamentalist Christianity in particular in America and in the UK, and I guess to a lesser extent Australia. So I remember like watching like Ahmed Deedat debates and really enjoying those because he was crushing the Christian evangelists. Do you see what I'm saying? At that point, actually, I remember I was in India sitting in an internet cafe and watching Ahmed Deedat videos at one point. I think I must have been 16 at that point. So I don't know if I had yet sort of latched on to or focused on Islam. But within New Atheism, okay, just to sort of comment on New Atheism and sort of what's going on there, and then to focus in on the Islamophobia and how I sort of got absorbed into that. So New Atheism, obviously its roots go back like 100 or more years, right? There are various sort of traditions and genealogies that sort of came together in the aftermath of 9/11 and sort of the election of George W. Bush to sort of fed into and ran into this sort of movement, right? So there's kind of a secularist tradition, especially in England, right, that goes back into the 19th century, and with a big sort of focus on wanting to create a society free of sort of conventional religion, superstition, a society where people are all sort of these sort of rational agents, or this is the line anyway, right? This is the sort of the basic sort of gist, I think, of those kinds of movements and ideologies. And I think secular humanism sort of evolved out of that as well, for example. So this is one of the traditions or the streams. There's also an existing tradition of Islamophobia. Now, obviously, there are types of Islamophobia that go all the way back, maybe to the beginning, right? Or to, I mean, it depends on the given case, right? But there are all kinds of negative portrayals and demonizations of Muslims in the early medieval period and sort of, let's say, like Syriac literature or whatever. And of course, this is a universal phenomenon. Every religious tradition is sort of producing negative depictions of every other religious tradition throughout the Middle Ages and, well, I guess into the present to varying degrees, right? So, okay. And so then there's also the Latin tradition that follows that in Western Europe as well, all kinds of negative depictions. And obviously there's a kind of general kind of Orientalism as well, of various types of Orientalism, but including a kind of like negative stereotyping of, for example, Ottoman society and all kinds of sort of anxiety about that and so on and so forth. So I know that there are sort of threads and traditions that go all the way back. But in terms of the modern type, I think that one of the key figures that it goes back to is maybe a figure who's not very well known now, but there was a writer named, and I'm going to mispronounce this, so Bat-Yor. And she wrote a book on something about, I can't remember the title anymore, but it's about like the treatment of dhimmis under Muslim rule, like the history of dhimmis essentially. And this is like, she was hugely influential, and this is in I think like the 80s and the 90s. And so she was hugely influential as sort of an intellectual like godmother for more well-known figures like Robert Spencer and so on. And so and that goes back before 9/11, right? Like this is actually a common feature of extreme ideologies, is that they just sort of exist on the fringes of society, and then when there's a crisis and it becomes expedient for extremely wealthy people who have various kinds of vested interests, funding will suddenly flood to a pre-existing fringe ideology, and then it becomes suddenly much more mainstream. And so this is what happened with Islamophobia. In the aftermath of 9/11, a huge amount of funding sort of flooded from sort of neoconservative and sort of Zionist kinds of funding bodies and think tanks and so on, sort of flooded to these kinds of figures and this kind of authorship, and became much more widespread in, for example, American society. Although it was really, I think, it reached its sort of a new level in the aftermath of the economic crash. And that's where Islamophobia became on a whole nother level, I think, across American society, because there was a much more sort of intensive and widespread need for scapegoating, right? And so you had this explosion of sort of anti-Sharia movements and stop the Islamization of America and all this other rubbish. And sort of things became a lot more mainstream through that. But my memory is that it started just through like debating, like just arguing with people in like comment sections, like the comment section of a YouTube video or something. And with the sort of typical arrogance of the new atheist, I knew that every religion was false, right? Every religion was just automatically, axiomatically, it was all rubbish and socially harmful and so on and so forth. So even though I didn't know anything about it, like I knew nothing about Islamic history or any, religious history for that matter. But if you have that sort of complete certainty, and then, for example, you get into an argument with someone in like a YouTube comment section, and all you have to do is like, well, I know I'm right. All I have to do is just go and find the proofs, right? I know they're out there because I know I'm right, because I know this is like an evil religion or something like all religions. And so I then, where do you go if you need to find out the reasons why Islam is false? You have to go to, Jihad Watch. You have to go to Religion of Peace or whatever. All these sort of early sort of Islamophobic websites.
In my eyes, it's like a group chat that gets out of hand, a forum that gets out of hand. And it became so accessible so fast with the speed of the internet around that time. And it formalized into like a coherent group that could like share ideas and actually, I guess, network together and obviously with the funding on the backside, it was a culmination of all these different, it's like a hydra, you know what I mean? You cut one head off, there's two more that grow, it's everywhere.
The thing I'm trying to get to, this is all true, but the concept I'm trying to pick out is more like a poison chalice, right? I was just a dumb new atheist who thought that all religions were false. And so, but when I went to find for the case, just by coincidence, I happened to end up arguing, like normally I'm arguing with Christians. I happen to be arguing with a Muslim. Okay, now I need something against Islam. And then where do I go to? And it's these hideous websites that are like constantly cherry picking, like, for example, every crime that happens to involve a Muslim then gets put on some giant list of Islamic violence. Right? Just like this, but that's the kind of websites that were available. Do you see what I'm saying? And so you come just for ammunition for, okay, in this case, it's against Islam. And suddenly what you're actually absorbing is something a lot more extreme and a lot more insidious, like a level of demonization of Muslims that's way beyond sort of what is sort of the normal discourse around Christians, right? This is one of the sort of funny things about Islamophobia, is that Islamophobes will often say, I'm just saying the same thing about Muslims that I say about Christians. But when I say it about Christians, everyone's fine with it. And when I say it about Muslims, everyone is sort of, complaining or criticizing. And this is a complete lie. What they're saying about Muslims is not even close to what they're saying about Christians, right? The threat of Christians was like, they're going to put creationism in the school. And the threat of Muslims, again, in this sort of discourse, was like a civilizational threat. And like, I mean, depending on how vulgar and depending on the iteration, all kinds of things, the sort of the accusations of like all kinds of extreme criminal activity and violence and terrorism and blah, blah, blah. It was a completely different kind of claim, actually. The sort of things that they were saying about Muslims are actually way more similar and belong fundamentally to the category of anti-Semitism or the old anti-Catholic sort of or anti-papist kind of bigotry that used to be popular in America until, I don't know, like the 30s or something, where it's like, it's about like disloyalty, right? Foreign hordes, demographics, children's safety. it's a whole different set of issues. This is actually a different kind of phenomenon. But so because it's sort of like, oh, we're against every religion, and then here I see all these people with all these websites and these speakers and so on who are providing the anti-Islamic stuff. It's easy just to get sort of drawn in to suddenly absorb the poison, and next thing you know, you become almost like a far-right extremist, right? You've absorbed all this sort of xenophobia and so on. So that's, for me, this was the process. And so this brings us to a very strong mechanism that I think is behind Islamophobia and things like that. Not just Islamophobia, but all kinds of these sort of xenophobia and things like that. And that is like a seething resentment, right? So I think that, and so this is, so the sort of research I'm sort of referring to now is research that's being done on terrorism, serial killers, fascism, the historical phenomenon. I mean, like in the 30s, and there's a very common tendency for these kinds of people to be from middle class backgrounds, but to have experienced some kind of social area or failure. Right. So these are people who, so the reason why it's sort of connected to being middle class is that if you're middle class, you're more likely to have a strong sense of entitlement and for that entitlement to be thwarted. Right. If you're from an elite background, you have a strong sense of entitlement and that's just your life. Right. It's that you don't actually sort of run into sort of in a strong way that being completely thwarted frequently. Conversely, if you're from a very poor background, life is bad and life will continue to be bad. Right? There's not like a strong expectation that, oh, I'm going to have a wonderful life and everything, I'm going to get a great job, everything's going to go my way. Right? And so the demographic that tends to manifest this kind of seething sort of rage and sort of seething resentment, it tends to be people from middle class backgrounds, right? And that's the reason why. It's because they have that combination of entitlement and precarity. And so
but I think we also spoke about the lower class really not having the privilege to be able to think about, whose fault is this? And then the higher classes, of course, don't really have anyone to blame because they don't have to worry about their food, they don't have to worry about their security and their wealth basically. So yeah, it's exactly. I think we spoke off air about it being the Goldilocks area.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
I was saying they also to highlight what Ahmed was saying, like they also view these people as a threat of taking what little they have, so it adds like this kind of social tension. And also they rub shoulders with these people a lot more often than like an elite person would, so there's also that tension of just daily interaction and proximity.
Yeah, although I think that on average, people who have a seething hatred towards some demographic aren't usually like friends with and frequently like live with. So they can see them, but they're normally separate. I think that's generally the case. And so it allows you to see...
From like an American society perspective, I was thinking more so like, okay, I grew up in rural Virginia with factories everywhere, right? And farms everywhere. We have like a very mixed demographic of low class white Americans mixed in with Middle Eastern men and women who are washing their feet in the sink every day, 5 times a day for prayer. And they can't really, and this is something like I said, I grew up in a very conservative high school as well. So I dealt with Islamophobia and I got caught in that little, post I guess recession wind of it that you mentioned. So I was in school during those years, but like people would always bring up, oh, my dad said Muslims wash their feet in the sink like weirdos, and there's like this whole thing. Like, I don't even know how to approach that. I don't know how to answer that. So I think it is a little bit unfamiliarity at that level.
I can see what Delmon's saying as well, because you see someone like Tommy Robinson, who's like from these areas where there are Muslims, like Luton Town. They don't actually, you're right, they're not friends with them, but they see them and they sort of have this resentment towards them. But you're right, they do witness them. And then the middle class is usually in these suburbs with them where these people from overseas come, but maybe they don't know English. And so they get frustrated at them, seeing them like these people weren't here before. But yeah, that's possibly another reason why the middle class. It's an interesting question.
For sure. And so there is this strong tendency for the middle class people in particular to be drawn into extreme forms of xenophobia and in similar kinds of ideologies that sort of allow them to sort of identify some kind of scapegoat. and then to sort of lash out at that scapegoat. And so I think basically something similar is going on with Islamophobia, although I will acknowledge that there is a spectrum. There is a spectrum of Islamophobia, and I think that what I'm describing is going to be much more of the motor for the more extreme varieties, right? So, and just sort of going off what Delman just said, so we might, and this is true for like racism and all kinds of things like this, there's often a spectrum, right? And so, we might say there is Islamophobia of ignorance, which is sort of the least kind, right? And so this is, this just happens often. People just pick up sort of stereotypes or misunderstandings, or something is unfamiliar and they think it's weird. Okay, so there's sort of a kind of ignorance-based sort of negative stereotyping, or just even neutral stereotyping, depending on the case. And so that is actually, I think, very easy to counter. The people who I think are basically impossible to convert, right? It's like a miracle when these people, like, it's extremely, I'm not saying it's impossible. It can happen. It does happen, but it's very, very difficult. Are the people who are more of the type that I was describing before, people who have a profound seething resentment. You're not fighting the false beliefs that they've picked up about Muslims and Islam. You're fighting a really powerful, strong emotional incentive for them to have a scapegoat, for them to be able to lash out and attack other people. And that's really hard to shift. And that's not just the case for Islamophobia. That's the case for all kinds of, racism and so on, when it's at that level, when it's the seething type, when it's the sort of extremely ideological type. I think it's very difficult. I actually don't recommend trying to convert those people or convince them out of those beliefs. I think the better strategy is just to marginalize those people and to sort of deprive them from of oxygen and social influence as possible.
So would you say for you personally, you were a mix? Would you say for you personally, you were a mix between the seething hatred and the ignorance? Because you did come to change, but then you also have mentioned to us before off air that you changing was a bit of a miracle. Like, it was very, very unlikely and an anomaly.
Yeah, it's a good question. And since we had that off air discussion, I have been thinking about it and pondering it. So my Islamophobia was most extreme when I first became an Islamophobe, right? So I remember believing in like taqiyya, the sort of widespread sort of stealth jihad and all this kind of like really like extreme kind of loony sort of right-wing conspiracy theories and xenophobic conspiracy theories about Muslims. But what I also had was a very strong desire to win arguments, which is precisely what got me into the Islamophobia in the first place. And it, to some degree, got me out. Because in order to win, I had to start, and this was like, I think I was like 17, 18 at this point. Like, so in the last year of high school, I was already starting to read and buy academic books about Islam. Sort of, like Ira Lapidus's, sort of survey of Islamic history and these kinds of things. And so in order to win arguments, I had to cite academic sources. But academic sources don't allow you to justify those more extreme and loony kinds of beliefs. So the reliance on academic sources necessarily moderated my beliefs, if that makes sense, right? So I sort of became more of like a, I don't know, like a kind of a, maybe like a rational centrist kind of Islamophobe, if that makes sense. So it's sort of like still demonizing Islam, still demonizing Muslims, but with far less sort of loony kinds of claims and ideas and so on. Okay, so then how did I get out of it? This happened at the end of my undergrad at Monash University. So when I went to Monash, I was at this point an Islamophobe, right? Not just a new atheist, I was now like a more fully fledged Islamophobe. And so I chose from the outset to specialize in studying Islamic history, but also like Middle Eastern politics. And, for example, history of the Arab-Israeli conflict and things like this. And the link there, by the way, is just as Islamophobia was kind of a poison chalice that you could accidentally absorb as just a generic new atheist, and then Zionism was in turn a further kind of poison chalice that you would absorb through Islamophobia. So all of the anti-Islamic websites were also extremely pro-Israeli. So I just absorbed all of these sort of Zionist talking points. And like, so I used to be like a really fervent supporter of Israel. So how did that happen? It was just because it was there mixed in with all the anti-Islamic, like here's a list of verses, the worst verses in the Quran. Oh, and also Palestinians are evil animals and terrorists and so on, and Jews just want to live peacefully in Israel. And so they're just mixed together. When you absorb one, you just absorb the other. And so when I went to Monash, I was also studying, and of course, a big part of Islamophobia as well is claims about modern terrorism. Right? The threat of Islam is not just, there's some evil old books or something. It's also the current threat of Islamism and so on. And so both the interest
and you can
in
see
sort
that
of,
in terms of the Zionism, which we haven't spoken about too much, but the Zionism, you can really see that the number one claim from far-right Zionists is that, well, Hamas and Palestinians are all terrorists. They're just all terrorists. They all want to kill everybody, right? Which is a political statement. They have their theological ideas and philosophical sort of ideas as well. But that's probably the most cited, right? As you're saying, the terrorism and political claims are also inextricably linked to the Islamophobia.
Definitely.
Even a step further is like, even a step further would be like they even go as far to say even if the kids aren't, inherently evil, they will eventually become terrorists. They will eventually be indoctrinated, and therefore they are not human. They're dehumanized at that level where, okay, they're a potential enemy, so it doesn't matter anyway.
Right. Preemptive justification for child murder. And so that's right. And in fact, I remember people would post, and Memory TV. So here again, you see the confluence of these huge neocon bodies and funding bodies and so on with Islamophobia. I remember the clips, seeing the clips that were meant to sort of instill this kind of hostility towards not just Muslims, but specifically, for example, Palestinians, of, Palestinians on some TV show, Mickey Mouse is teaching them how to be a terrorist or something. And this is telling you, it's like, even the children are terrorists, even the children are extremists. You can see that sort of poison being sort of spread, even about, for example, Palestinian children. And obviously this is most extreme in Israel. And we see the fruits of this with, children have been methodically shot in the head with sniper rifles. You can't do that by accident. You can't just by coincidence repeatedly get a precision shot in the head of a child. So they're deliberately murdering children. Anyway, we shouldn't go into it. But it's, so you can sort of see the confluence of all these kinds of elements. And I think this is part of the sort of reason for the propagation of Islamophobia. Again, as I mentioned, ideologies get propagated according to the needs that they fulfill, either on the part of the adherents or on the part of the people who fund and support those kinds of ideologies, right? And so in this case, for example, I think that a big appeal for Islamophobia politically among giant right-wing American sort of political donors and that sort of thing is the way that and there's also a question of how deliberate is this? It's interesting to think, are people so cynical and self-aware, or is it happening organically because people just kind of, it vibes with them because it's in their interests, right? So there's an interesting question about the mechanisms there. But you can see that Islamophobia is a really nice way to consolidate a kind of narrative of Christian-Jewish alliance against the evil Muslim hordes. And look how badly we were both treated as dhimmis throughout Islamic history, blah, blah, blah. And then this helps to sort of consolidate the project of, a deep American alliance with Israel and Christian support for Israel, for example. And then all of Israel's foreign policy.
Saying basically that these online spaces generated this hatred within you to Islam.
Sure.
And with that came the Zionism and the hatred of Palestinians, because the political and philosophical, theological elements are interlinked. So,
yes.
So now you're in university. Now I imagine you had exposure to Muslims as well, more Muslims and different cultures.
This is true.
So now I imagine that now this is the sort of turning point to the Joshua we know today.
All I can say is that I took 2 classes, and those classes shattered the foundations of my worldview, and that in turn opened me up to have my mind changed on my view of religion in general and Islam in particular. And so what shattered my world, the pillars of my worldview, was a class that I took on the history of history of American foreign policy, and another class on the history of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And I took the let's start with the American class first, actually. So the class was taught by some American liberal professor, so I'm sure he has his, depending on who's teaching the class, different things get emphasized. Nevertheless, or regardless, we went through sort of from maybe even from before the founding, or like the around the time of the founding, like the revolution, all the way through until sort of pretty recently. And it was a horror story. It was just like one like atrocity after another, right? Just like never-ending imperialism. And again, for sort of the new atheism and the Islamophobia, it's very much sort of tied in with a kind of Western chauvinism. And we have the great Western, enlightened civilization, and everyone else is sort of barbaric, and we have to defend this, and we're the good guys, and we're a civilizing force. And even if you acknowledge, like, oh, yes, there was some bad imperialism in the past, but still, now we're the good guys. And what came through so strongly, going through the history of it was the Spanish-American War and the conquest of Cuba and the conquest of the Philippines and the massacres there and all the sort of destruction of all these and invasions of all these Latin American republics, through to, I don't know, the Vietnam War. And it was just like, there's no line. There's no line at which it's like, oh, they used to be bad and now they're good. It's like, no, the atrocities and the domination and the exploitation continues up until the present. And so this completely shattered that kind of Western chauvinist kind of framework that I had, which was not directly the Islamophobia, but which was a kind of a load-bearing pillar, if that makes sense. And then the other one was the class on the Arab-Israeli conflict. This one was more interesting because the teacher was a sort of right-leaning Jewish American professor who had sort of written for like Jerusalem Post, or the sort of establishment right-wing newspaper in Israel. So not at all a liberal, let alone a leftist, right? So I think there was no Noam Chomsky or Norman Finkelstein or Ilan Pappé or Avi Shlaim or anyone else in the syllabus, right? The whole thing obviously was biased in a kind of very pro-Israeli. And in fact, like they even had like one of the lectures was given by like an Israeli diplomat. I don't know if it was the ambassador. I just think now it's like it's sort of hard to believe. Like, are you going to invite a Palestinian representative to also give a lecture? It wouldn't even be considered. It's just like in retrospect, it's just like extraordinary how sort of normalized that kind of thing was, right? Anyway, okay. So I took this class, and what I experienced for the first time for Palestinians was empathy. Because it just hit me already in like the first class or two. It just like clear as day, I realized the thing that the Palestinians, the things that they were afraid of were real. They happened. If I was a Palestinian, I would also have been opposed to Jewish colonization. I also would have been afraid of being dispossessed. And I would be extremely furious and devastated if I was then kicked off my land, accompanied by all kinds of massacres and torture and so on, all the things that went on in 1947-48. So it just suddenly I had empathy for the first time. And this was the beginning of this sort of falling apart of all these sort of pro-Israeli kind of talking points and myths and so on that I had absorbed up until that point. So the sort of Western chauvinism in general was shattered, and the sort of Zionism in particular was shattered as well. And that was despite the bias of the teacher, who obviously is a very sort of, pro-Israeli teacher, although he was an excellent lecturer, I will say, but very biased. But even in his class, even with that sort of skewed kind of right-wing framing, the basic facts were clear enough that I just realized that my sort of feelings about sort of the justice of what was going on there and the rightness of what was going on were just completely wrong. And so these two events probably are what primed me to then be receptive to what came next. And that was, again, everything happens through a random argument. right? So I got into Islamophobia through some random argument in some comment section. Okay, and then I got out to another kind of random interaction. And that was that I began to encounter and argue with Marxists and communists about Islamophobia, about terrorism and these kinds of things. Because even though they were all atheists, they're a different kind of atheist, right? Their view of religion is that, and culture and ideology is that these things are modulated by deeper, socioeconomic and other kinds of material forces, and that the Quran can't explain the different ways that the Quran is being interpreted. Something external and in the environment is going to have to explain why one person interprets it one way and someone else interprets it the other, or hadith for that matter, or fiqh, or whatever, right? And so, and what's funny is that I was familiar with this kind of argumentation, but only selectively. This is the basic argument against the idea that Islam or the Quran caused the Abbasid Golden Age, right? Well, there isn't really a correlation here. Like, you have Islam and no science, you have science and no Islam, and then sometimes you have science and Islam. So something else is going to have to explain the efflorescence of science under the Abbasids. And when that helped to undermine an apologetical religious claim, I got it. But when that exact same reasoning served to demolish sort of Islamophobic and new atheist ideas about the Bible or the Quran or whatever causing this, that, or the other, somehow I'd never heard of it, right? And so through this sort of arguing with these kinds of a different kind of atheist, not only different kind of atheist, but extremely effective debaters as well, I should say. And all of my views were just annihilated. And I knew immediately, like just within a few discussions, I knew I could not defend any of my views on religion and politics and history or almost anything, right? It was like extremely sort of revolutionary moment in my conception of things, if that makes sense. And so that was the shattering moment where it just all fell apart, not just Islamophobia, new atheism. And that was in my honors year. I think that's right. Is it my honors year or was it the year before, end of my undergrad? I can't remember, sorry, but it's either like, I think it's 2015. I think it was 2015. And so then I finished my honors. And at this point, and then I applied for MPhil in Islamic Studies and History at Oxford. And so at this point, I'd already specialized through years of polemics and arguing and reading. I'd acquired a specialization in Islam and Islamic history. And I suddenly found myself without the sort of political or activist or ideological motivation that had got me there in the first place. But by this point, because I now had this specialization, I just had acquired an intrinsic joy in just academic study. Reading, writing, synthesizing sources, developing arguments. It's an inherently joyful kind of experience. It's an inherently satisfying. And I had just come to just really enjoy, maybe I would even say love. I don't know when the love set in or when the like now I love what I'm reading. Like, I love the hadiths that I'm reading. I love the hadith scholars that I'm sort of researching, and I don't know when that set in. But at some point I'd acquired a sort of a deep kind of, I don't know, like, I guess like affection for what the sort of material I was working with. And so that then carried me forward to Oxford.
Okay, that's very interesting. Yeah, because you had all this information that you researched for hate purposes that you now had, but you didn't have the hate. So you're like, oh, what do I do with this now? That's very interesting because I feel like
Exactly.
a lot of people have similar the backgrounds. Like, of course, I was on the opposite when I was growing up. I was defending Islam against Islamophobes, and then I just got interested academically. Like, what's the true historical case? What's the philosophy? Obviously, I'm more of a philosophical rather than history background. And of course, at Oxford, you went with Saqib Hussain, the Quranic studies scholar. For those of you who don't know, check out Saqib Hussain's work. Who now I'm at Oxford with Saqib Hussain's nephew. And so we're friends. And Joshua, when he was there, coming from Australia, so I came from Australia and I met with Hassan Adnan, Saqib Hussain's nephew. Now we're friends at Oxford. Joshua came from Australia and was friends with Saqib Hussain. So we have this little joke that Saqib Hussain's family always has to have like an Australian with them.
It's a beautiful story that you just told, but it also has this underlying sadness to it for me, because it took you getting to Oxford, finishing your undergrad, having these great lecturers, having these great friends to even get to that point. And it's actually further proves my theory, I guess, that being involved in academia with Islam is the best way to counter Islamophobia in a lot of ways. Because it's a more, I think it's easier for a non-Muslim to hear you out when you're citing a non-Muslim. You know what I mean? I find this to be quite effective. Obviously, there's some other underlying problems with that, but I think there's an underlying sadness that you have to reach this level of education to the point that you become a specialist in the field in order to like deconstruct all of that. So I guess that's my takeaway from a great
and that's
story.
also the case. I think one of the questions that we want to answer in this interview, this discussion as well, is how do we engage Islamophobes and Zionists? How can we change them? And I think it's really telling. I mean, yours is very it's going to be different for people psychologically, but yours is very telling that it was very educational. Like, so when people say, oh, I know you said there's a class of people that will never change, but there are two classes that you said that would. And so when people say, oh, education doesn't work, these classes don't work, let's not engage with X, Y, Z, we have to rethink that and show, your story was those two classes that really shattered your worldview turned you from a Zionist to pro-Palestine and Islamophobe to pro-multiculturalism, pro-human. So yeah.
But I have two caveats with all that, though. So in my case, I don't know if it was all the learning about Islam that actually made the difference there. And in fact, there are people who will go through. I don't think most academics are Islamic studies academics who are not Muslims. I don't think most of them are Islamophobes. I think that the average sort of spectrum is from sort of arrogant kind of secularists who just sort of generally look down on religion, across to people who kind of love and have a deep affection for religion. I think that's the normal kind of spectrum. And then you obviously have Muslims as well. And then you do have some Islamophobes as well. But my point is that you do have some Islamophobes. Every now and again, you will meet people like this. Or even for example, I don't know, like an evangelical Christian who is doing a degree at Oxford just to get the degree so that they can then have the authority, right? But will then just be sort of still kind of writing negatively about Islamic history and how it's just sort of a history of violence and this and that and the other. So I actually don't think it's quite a matter of just going further and further up into Islamic studies, if that makes sense. There's also some kind of personal factor and social factor involved as well. But I admit it's very tricky. So I don't have all the answers here of how exactly you solve these or you engage with these.
It's sort of like how
it's complicated.
In philosophy, a big question is how do you go from theism to atheism in philosophy of religion? And Joe Schmidt from Majesty of Reason, his YouTube channel, he's also a PhD student at Princeton. I really enjoy his channel. He sort of talks about how your religious beliefs are a concoction of, well, number one, you do have sort of your rational argumentation, but it's a concoction of also of your memories, your upbringing, your experiences, the books and content you consume, even the order in which you consume them. Even the order in which you consume them can obviously affect it. So it's a concoction. Obviously, this raises interesting theological questions. So, what does this mean for heaven and hell, and to what extent can God hold people accountable? But that's a conversation for another day. The second part of this interview, we want to look at your actual academic work rather than your background. So let's talk about hadith. For those of you who don't know what a hadith is basically a saying or a doing of the Prophet Muhammad, and it's usually transmitted through what we call a sanad or a chain. So basically an example would be the Prophet said XYZ and he told this, a companion heard it or a number of companions heard it, then they told the generation after them, and then the generation after them was told, and the generation after them, and then eventually maybe 150 years or 100 years or 200 years down the line, a scholar came and sort of evaluated all the different sayings that were circulated, and then they wrote it down in a book. And then each scholar might give a classification for whether a hadith is genuinely going back to the Prophet or a companion or not. So that's just a very quick overview for those of you who don't know what the hadith is. Okay, a big controversial field. I remember your video, of course, as I mentioned earlier with Jawad, the 21 reasons to be skeptical of hadith, which caused a lot of debate and discussion. And then there was the Yasser Qadi video where he said that academic secular historians don't take hadith as seriously as traditional scholars, and he got into trouble for that. Today we want to talk about your views on the reconstruction of hadith? Because you've told me that now you're in the reconstructive phase. You're more like, okay, we've talked about the problems, we spoke about the problems. How can we get around these problems? And we can do that probably in light of your case study of the Quran, but also we'll bring in other things like epigraphy and how well Isnad-cum-matn analysis can work. So for those of you who don't know, that's basically an analysis of the different content and sources of different hadith. So yeah, we'll start off generally, and then we'll go into the cases and see how the discussion flows. But what are your 21 reasons? Okay, we probably don't have 21, but what are your reasons? What are your ways? Yeah, what are your ways to get back to the Prophet or the companions? Is there a way, or is it impossible? If there is a way, how are we doing it, and what are the best cases to show this?
Yeah, there are definitely ways. Even the most sort of skeptical scholars, sort of at the apex of skepticism, which was really like the 80s and the 90s, always thought that there were some things that we could know. So some of the things I'm going to mention are things that even like Patricia Kroner, for example, argues for and so on. But others are things, for example, that are sort of building off Harold Motzki, sort of the great German scholar of Hadith. And some of this is sort of already sort of touched upon. In fact, an article I wrote, that was the first peer-reviewed article that I published, which is a sort of a commentary on chapter 1 of Slaves on Horses by Patricia Kroner, and sort of building on some of her ideas and sort of elaborating and explaining and also bringing in more recent scholarship and so on. And so some of these points you can find in that article. Others you can find in a sort of very sort of preliminary form in my article that I published on the canonization of the Quran, part 1, and part 2 will be just a direct study of all of these different hadiths on the canonization of the Quran by Uthman. And so this sort of, some of the methods I'm about to explain will be fully on display there. Also, my most recent article, although I don't know, number one, I don't know if it has pagination yet. So I think there's only like a advanced version that's available, and even then it's hard to access because it's for the special volume for the 2024 Islamophobic analysis conference, right? But the article that I published there. But in this article as well, even though my conclusions there are largely negative, the method that I'm using is also one that can be used positively. Okay, so here are the considerations that I would appeal to, or do appeal to, or will appeal to sort of identify authentic information preserved in hadith from the time of the Prophet, about the Prophet himself, it just depends on the given case. So the first consideration is something like comparative anthropology, or our established background knowledge about societies and movements like early Islam, or like the situation of early Islam. So if we find a report, whether it's about the Prophet or it's about the context of the Prophet, pre-Islamic Arabia, and it's the sort of thing that we find in similar kinds of contexts, say in early religious movements or in tribal cultures that don't live under states, for example, you tend to have similar kinds of religious authorities that emerge, like the Kuhan, the pre-Islamic Arabian soothsayers, are very similar in fundamental ways to other kinds of sort of diviners, or kind of maybe I shouldn't call them religious figures exactly, but kind of supernatural specialists who exist in a society and who can sort of communicate with spirits. And so when we find, for example, these kinds of figures described for pre-Islamic Arabia, and it's the sort of thing that we find in similar kinds of societies and similar kinds of conditions, that's a good reason to accept at least the broad accuracy of the picture being painted there, right? So that's one example. So it's sort of comparative anthropology, or sort of established background knowledge, something like that. And so you can then pick out at least sort of the gist of institutions and phenomena and so on that you find, for example, recorded in hadith. And so, and even if the details are false, or even if the narratives are false, the reports still in some way preserve something authentic. So this is something interesting about, and a difference between secular scholarship and traditional scholarship, is that What we're looking for is not necessarily that the report in toto is sahih. What we're looking for is authentic information, which could be preserved in a false report, actually, at times, right? And so even if the narrative is made up and it's stereotyped and it contains miracles or whatever, the basic sort of assumptions about what the soothsayers are and how they function seem to be correct, right? And so we can sort of project that information all the way back.
That's
Okay, so this is
interesting
one.
that you see that even if the report is false, you can gain something authentic. So you would accept, because there's a big debate in the tradition, right? Whether a daif narration is a
Yes.
hujjah, if it's a proof or not. So your view is, I mean, I don't want to get sidetracked too much, but I just thought I'd note that.
Sure.
So yeah, but
Yeah,
we can come back to that. We can come back to that.
Sure. So this is one consideration. Another one would be early Islamic chronology is generally reliable. So the chronology of the early caliphate and the civil wars and this sort of stuff, and who was the ruler when and where, who was the governor when and where, that kind of information tends to be strongly corroborated by other kinds of evidence, early non-Muslim sources, inscriptional evidence, coins, etc. At least or back to maybe the first fitna. And at that point, there just isn't really corroboration because it's too early, right? And there's no coins or whatever. And so chronology seems pretty good. And some scholars will project that even back to at least the Medinan period of the Prophet's life. I'm open to that, but I think it's a lot more difficult because there are all kinds of contradictions that you find in the chronology of the life of the Prophet. So it's very difficult. So I probably wouldn't, I don't know if this is very helpful for our purposes here. Okay, but I just wanted to acknowledge that there is a kind of material preserved in Islamic sources that's actually very reliable. And that's the sort of what Kroner called the secular tradition, sort of chronology and prosopography. In other words, lists of who was in power when and where, that kind of information. Okay, then we have genealogy and similar kinds of information. So this is information about who people were, people's names, basic relationships, tribal identities, that sort of stuff. And that sort of information seems pretty well preserved. And this is based on all kinds of early inscriptions where we see people's names. Obviously, we have to be careful because, if you just have so-and-so son of so-and-so, well, okay, maybe it's someone who's recorded, maybe it's not. But when you have like a succession of names, we have a cluster of people together and it's all like one family, and it's the same cluster of people that you find, recorded in the later Islamic literary sources. That seems likely to be what explains this, is that these were real people and that they were later remembered, correctly, who the people were, their basic relationships, that kind of stuff. And there are also some studies on, like, for example, marriage patterns, where it seems like coherent and realistic. Marriage patterns, in like the first century or even on the eve of Islam, that sort of thing. And so it seems like basic information about, in other words, later Arabs were very interested in remembering the identities of their ancestors and the relationships of their ancestors. Even if stories or narratives are not necessarily like accurately recorded or highly distorted or just made up, basic information about who people are seems to be pretty well recorded. So this is a way of picking out people.
Yeah.
Right. So I would
just
generally
to circle it back together. Just to circle it, bring it back together. You're saying that these sources, the genealogy, the basic information, the inscriptions of people's names and stuff like that, when we see that they can be connected with hadith, this is one way of knowing a hadith is also preserving some accurate information or working off a historical foundation.
Yes.
Okay,
now, this won't help us that much with hadith in terms of anything beyond the basic fact that the hadith records people, it says things about people who we know existed, right? So it won't, although
it can help with existence, because some people, I mean, it's a genuine question.
Yes.
But some people do bring up, the skeptics bring up, like, okay, well, did this person even exist, or even tribal affiliation. If you can learn that there's X person who's affiliated with a certain tribe, you can then start to deduce likelihoods, right? Like, okay, if they were part of this tribe, they probably lived here. So information that we didn't have, we can sort of deduce this person might have lived here. This is probably what their religion might have been before Islam or after Islam. Yeah. So back to you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Although there is, like, occasionally you will find something like some sort of prayer formula that's attested in later hadith, and then it's like on the Dome of the Rock or something, so at least shows that it existed early and then has been preserved through and now survives in the form in this or that hadith. But it probably will not help us beyond that. And obviously we want to go further if possible. And so, but it's still worth acknowledging, okay, we at least have a kind of solid framework to sort of build off, which is about chronology, at least back to around maybe like the first fitna, and basic information about people, who they are, and so on. So I would generally presume.
So it can be supplemented. So, I mean, I still see people, they don't use any hadith at all because they're so allergic to it. They say, oh, well, historians don't take it seriously. But when you do have, now we have inscriptions and stuff like that. So it's fine. Like when you have, from a secular point of view, when you have other evidence, as you just said, the list that you just gave, it's okay for people to say, well, actually, this sort of, these set of hadith that relate to this is additional evidence. This is this supplements what
it's something that should be taken into consideration. Oh, sorry, I overtalked. Yeah,
no,
I agree.
So that's what I'm trying to point out, because I think a lot of people don't do that still. A lot of people, they just want to focus on an inscription. They just want to focus on genealogy, whereas they should also be opening up hadith books and seeing what they can, what connections they could make, instead of sort of being fearful of, oh, I don't want to overuse the tradition because it's unreliable. And I think this is one way to sort of bridge that. Yeah, sure.
I understand. Look, I understand the caution, because there are obviously I've talked about whatever is the 21, or really it's the number has increased. It's like 25 problems. I don't want to downplay that these create a sort of extreme difficulty with using hadith, but I do think we can use hadith. So I agree with you. I think even though I understand people's caution, and this is a caution that I have as well, but as we move forward more and more, I think there are ways to sort of identify, and there'll be varying degrees here of probability. Some things are plausible, some things are probable, some things are certain, and in different cases it will be stuck with different levels of certainty. But I do think we can use hadith. Okay, so after genealogy, what's next? Let's say the criterion of dissimilarity. So the basic idea is that if you have a report that goes against the interests or assumptions of a group of people, and they're the ones transmitting that report, then they probably didn't make it up. Because if they had have made it up, then they would have made it up in a way that made sense to them, or that was in their interests. And so this is just a basic sort of kind of historical consideration. Obviously, it's used a lot in biblical studies, and we can use this in hadith as well. I mean, most famously, again, not a hadith example, but adjacent, the Constitution of Medina, just depicts Jews as part of the Ummah and whatever. And so it's sort of also ultra archaic Arabic that's hard to understand, requires all these glosses and so on. And so it seems to be extremely early. And in fact, the only time that where it really sort of fits is really the time of the Prophet. And then later on, if you're going to make it up, you'd make it up in different ways. This is just the basic argument for why it's basically authentic.
This is a random question.
Yeah.
Do you think those archaic words that you mentioned in the Constitution of Medina, do they ever show up in hadith broadly?
Oh, yes. Sometimes there are definitely cases, and so I'll give you another example. And this is sort of jumping ahead. The Treaty of Hudaybiyyah, the wording of the treaty is recorded, and in at least two different versions. And it looks to me, when I'm comparing them, like some of the so-called wording of the treaty is actually glosses, because it says the same thing twice in a couple of cases, and so they're actually glosses, and so. And this is like in the report that we can reconstruct back to Urwa ibn Azubair, and there's already a gloss in it. Now, why is there a gloss? Because it's archaic. Already they're struggling to understand. So he or someone before him is having to add in a gloss to even translate to other Arabs what this treaty is actually saying. And then you also have another version from the Iraqi, the Kufan common link Abu Ishaq, and he also has a redaction. And again, he has different glosses in there as well. And so you do sometimes find this in hadith. And so I would say this is absolutely a strong indicator that there is something early and genuine. I think basically they are differently quoting. They're both quoting the Treaty of Hudaybiyyah. So I think definitely there are cases when this will apply to hadith. Unfortunately, hadith are all paraphrases of paraphrases of paraphrases most of the time. So this generally will not work. Even if the hadith is authentic in some sense, it's a paraphrase of a paraphrase, and so archaic wordings usually I just will get lost like that. But there are some cases when there is a very sort of archaic wording that at least tells us that this is very archaic material. Okay,
and this is also acknowledged by the tradition as well, because of course traditional scholars don't usually they certainly don't analyze the language of hadith. Sorry, I shouldn't say language, so more like the linguistic nature of hadith more than they do the Quran, for example, which is obviously more a purest sense of fusha, whereas hadith sort of is in that period. Traditional scholars usually give a time zone of 150 years before and after the Prophet to start of that archaic Arabic.
Another way of at least triangulating extremely archaic material is early non-Muslim sources, right? So like, I mean, mostly it's like Christian Syriac writings, right? And so these have the advantage of having been transmitted continuously in writing from the time that they were written. They're just written compositions. They're in a written culture, a continuous sort of written culture, sort of Christian ecclesiastical culture. And so things are able to survive in a sense, like kind of fossils are able to be preserved. So if a Muslim tells a Christian, you know, whatever, 20 years or 50 years after Muhammad, something, and the Christian writes it down, at that point, that like archaic Islamic report or belief or idea is now preserved in an independent tradition in writing continuously up until the extant manuscripts. And so it allows us to sort of triangulate things that existed that early. And so we can see, you know, like basic ideas about Muhammad, you know, he was so focused on Abraham, for example, or that, you know, that his name is Muhammad, or, you know, something very close to that. You know, it shows that certain kinds of ideas and material that then are attested later in Hadith already exist and depending on the given case, you know, in the year, you know, whatever, 660 or even earlier, depending on the given case. And so this is another way to sort of triangulate authentic data that is recorded in later hadith and show that some proto version of this must have existed. But again, not the full hadith narrative. At least this information must have existed as early as this point, as early as like the first few decades of Islam. And then the final consideration, and this one is the most difficult to use, and it's the most just directly hadith based. And this is using a sort of combination, a series of critical methods, beginning with Isnad-cum-matn analysis, and then once you sort of reconstruct. Sorry, okay. If we're defining hadith, I'll have to define Isnad-cum-matn analysis. I'll just say it very simply. Isnad-cum-matn analysis is a form of analysis of hadiths where you look at the isnad or the sanad of each hadith, and then you try and find where in the list of people there is an overlap, and the same person is being cited as the common source from multiple different versions of the same hadith. And this is the common link. But then there's a step further, because there are actually multiple kinds of common link analysis. So to make it Isnad-cum-matn analysis, you can't just be looking at the isnad. You have to appeal to variation in the matns, in the actual text or wordings of the hadith, and use that to try and verify or justify the proposition that the cited alleged common source is the actual common source. And there are different ways of doing that. I give sort of a summary of the different ways of doing that in my chapter 1 of my PhD dissertation. Maybe we shouldn't go into that for now, but there are different ways of doing that. The version that I champion is about sort of correlations. You know, is a distinctive version of the material associated with the putative common link. And if it is, that's consistent with they have articulated a particular tradition in a particular way, and that has then been transmitted from them, even though there's all kinds of changes and variation. And then that explains why there's a particular version of the material that is then subsequently correlated with them, because what's being correlated with them is their wording, right? So we can posit that actually the basic shared distinctive tradition associated with them goes back to them. It's their wording, right? And then if you actually use sort of a technical diagram and you use sort of standard sort of textual critical principles, you can even reconstruct the wording, although this is actually very rare in Islamophobic analysis. I think I'm probably the first person to do this systematically. every single time I'm doing Isnad-cum-matn analysis, I'm documenting all the variants, and then I'm also reconstructing the wording. So it would probably be a mistake to say that is actually a standard part of Isnad-cum-matn analysis, but that is a standard part of my version of Isnad-cum-matn analysis.
So for those of you who don't know, it's a very fascinating. I mean, I've seen you have it on your website as well. The database of when you're looking at just that one hadith even. So Joshua will get all the different books out, look at every single variant of the same hadith that's talking about, say, wudu or something, ablution, and there'll be all these hundreds of chains, and it'll all be. It's like a tree diagram. It'll all be going back usually to, obviously, we'll be going back to a companion of a companion. We'll get into whether you can get back to a companion of a prophet. Of course, after the companion of a companion, usually you get the single chain. You get a single strand. So the prophet told a companion, and then the companion maybe told lots of people, or the companion of a companion told lots of people. So it's basically that bottleneck, right? We could say is a common link. That bottleneck is a common link. Sometimes you have partial common links where there's lots of people telling, a few people telling lots of different people. But yeah, okay. So that's ICMA.
By itself, Isnad-cum-matn analysis does not allow us to reach the prophet or even a companion. But this requires a caveat, because there are times when the prophet is the putative common link or a companion is the putative common link, right? And so there is one scholar recently, Seyfuddin Kara, who will argue in those cases where it's just, it's the same pattern of data, common link is the prophet or a companion, who will argue, okay, well, then they're genuine common links, right? I'm just applying the same ideas, and if it just so happens that the common link is the prophet, then the common link is the prophet, right? And so on that construal, if you do Isnad-cum-matn analysis the way that Saif is doing it, then you can just directly reach the prophet, right? And there will be many cases of that. Obviously, there are many hadiths, many isnads. There will be many cases where the prophet or a companion will appear to be a common link, right? Now, there are already some caveats that need to be mentioned there. There are times when, for example, the prophet or even a companion is not actually a common link. They're a character in a common story, right? Like Abraham is not a putative common link for different versions of the same story about Abraham. He's just the character in the story, right? And so this is one caution immediately, that there are times when there isn't even putatively the prophet or a companion is a common link. They're just a commonly cited character in the same story, right? Okay, so this is one type that we have to set aside. There are other cases where, like, there are just hadiths that are on a similar topic. So, they all cite the prophet, but these are different formulations. They're just they're different formulations. They're just different hadiths on the same topic. So it doesn't really make sense to describe the prophet as a common link there. The common link is meant to be the source for a particular formulation, but these are different formulations from different sources on the same topic, right? So again, we also want to put aside those cases. But even putting aside all those cases, there are cases where the prophet just is the commonly cited source for, let's say, some saying or something, or some maxim, or a companion, or whatever, right? Or even like a narrative or some sort of narration or something. Okay, so why do most scholars not accept that, right? Because Saif at the moment, I think, is the only or one of the only scholars who argues like that, right? Most other scholars, even Motsky, is never sort of identifying the prophet as a common link, for example, although he does argue that we can trace material back to him. We'll get to how he does that in a moment, but it's he's not doing that through Isnad-cum-matn analysis. He actually has has two different methods, but we're going to focus on one of them. The other one, I think, is very problematic. And okay, so we'll put that aside, although we can come back to it later if you want. Okay, so why this is actually not very widely talked about, but I think it's easy to detect why some scholars, or I would say at the moment, most scholars don't identify the prophet as a common link or even companions. And certainly these are the reasons that I don't. So we'll put aside other scholars for now. Again, this is not actually explicitly talked about in print a lot, so I'll just give my reasons for it. So one reason is the phenomenon of raising, or rafa. So basically, if you have an isnad that, let's say, originally it only goes back to a companion, right? So it's mawquf, it stops at the companion, right? So let's say it's the putative saying of a companion. But let's say then somebody takes this and they add on, from the Prophet, and now they've made it marfu'. It's now raised all the way back to the Prophet, right? Although the term marfu' is a neutral term. It can also just mean genuinely from the Prophet, right? But the term for falsely attributing it back to the Prophet is rafa', raising, right? Okay, so raising it back to the Prophet. I guess the idea is the Prophet's on the top in the metaphor. So you're pushing it all the way up to the Prophet, right? Okay, so raising was very common, and the target of raising is almost always the Prophet, although it does also happen to companions. Now, with companions, it could happen, different people could raise different hadiths back to different companions, right? So they wouldn't necessarily converge on the same companion. But if you're raising it back to the Prophet, that always produces the same outcome, which is a false common link. The Prophet suddenly appears as a false common link. So if raising was common, which it was, even the traditional sources acknowledge this, and this is something that you can find over and over and over just by doing a Isnad-cum-matn analysis, the Prophet is very often targeted by raisers. And so if two different people raise the same hadith back to the Prophet would suddenly appear to be a common link, right? And you might say, well, what are the odds that if they both engaged in a raising, that it would both converge on the Prophet? But the point is, that is very likely. It's not that likely for other companions. It is very likely for the Prophet, because everyone is specifically targeting the Prophet. There's something different about the Prophet that creates a more unique problem with false ascription than later common links, right? So this is raising. This is one mechanism. This also applies in Imami hadith. There's a limited number of authorities, Ja'far al-Sadiq or Muhammad al-Baqir or Ali are, again, these are similar kinds of figures who are going to be disproportionately targeted. So it's going to be also a bit of a problem there as well. And Ibn Abbas in the domain of exegetical hadith clarifying the meaning and context of the Quran.
So basically,
I've seen this myself.
Yeah. So there's a super figure basically, because you could imagine, if we use our historical imagination, that people were having debates and they wanted evidence for their debates, so evidence for their arguments or theses. And then somebody would say, well, I had in a report that goes back to this companion of a companion that this is how you interpret this word. And then somebody else would say, well, actually, I heard from a companion, and then another person would say, well, I'll do you one better. I actually, this is the Prophet. This is the Prophet saying what I'm saying. So this is potentially one way. And even in the tradition, of course, this is not just a secular thing. It happened. I think traditionalist scholars will probably say it less or sort of speak about it. Not speak about it less, but I think in the secular domain, secular scholars are much more, they think it's happening a lot more than traditional scholars, but traditional scholars also do acknowledge this idea that there is something as rafa. So yeah, this is
not just that it exists, but traditional scholars do think it happens a lot.
Okay,
But you're right.
So I mean, you can see them say that, okay, this is a, But I do want to say, and sort of, we spoke about this off air as well, is when we speak about the tradition versus the secular methods, now, of course, the methodology is very different. One of them being that when traditionists look at the chain and sources, they obviously acknowledge things like piety, which a secular scholar obviously does not have a criteria for. But the other thing I wanted to say that's interesting here is, of course, that not all schools of thought within Sunni traditionalism give equal weight to every, like a marfu' hadith. So the Hanafi and Maliki school famously accept mursal hadith. So for them, a common link hadith, even going back to companion of a companion, will be still very valuable, right? Because they accept that as a proof. There are interesting, and this sort of converges onto the secular study, because of course they were happy with regional practice, so they were much more happy with these chains that weren't raised back to the Prophet. I thought I'd point this out only because I think, this is not really pointed out. Certain people who are maybe not trained might think that what secular academics say is that what the tradition is doing was completely wrong. But that's not true. You can also have the aims of the tradition can sometimes be complemented by even what secular academics do, so to speak. I think that's important to point out, especially in light of these mursal ahadith that end with a companion or a successor.
Sure. Yeah. I was just affirming what you were just saying. There are definitely, whether or not there is like a contradiction or a disagreement, definitely depends on aims. So I would definitely agree that secular scholarship doesn't necessarily have to be in contradiction with traditional religious scholarship, for example. To the degree that they are pursuing different aims, then there's no disagreement at all. Although it is, I don't know to what degree they are and they aren't. It's something I'm still sort of thinking about. And it's an interesting question as to what degree are they pursuing the same aim? So maybe we can think about this more or come back to this later. It's a very interesting topic. But just to finish on the prophet, so one issue is that raising was very common. And another consideration is beyond raising, there were all kinds of pressures that were sort of incentivizing or leading to the proliferation of false parallel isnads, right? Whether that was because there were people who thought you should have multiple isnads, or there were people who just wanted their own isnads, or there were just people who just had an automatic or default isnad that they would just use for everything, or whatever. There are all kinds of sort of different mechanisms involved. And so it can also just be like mistakes. People just like are making mistakes and they misremember, and then they accidentally created a parallel isnad, whatever. And so, but when people create false isnads, it can sometimes create a later false common link. But since people are almost always projecting things back to the prophet, or are very frequently, it depends on the time period actually. The later you go, the more people are projecting everything back to the prophet. The prophet in particular is going to disproportionately appear as a false common link, right? Because there's going to be more, and even companions as well, because people are going to be more likely to be happy just having their own path back to a great companion and not necessarily need another companion, although they may also decide to have it via another companion as well. And so even for companions, but especially for the prophet, again, there's a special mechanism that is specifically making the prophet, and to a lesser degree companions, falsely appear to be common links in a way that doesn't really apply to later common links. There aren't these sort of special pressures to make Sufyan al-Thawri look like a false common link. There are these special pressures that are specifically making the prophet and companions look like false common links. And then the last consideration, especially with the prophet, even to some degree with companions, it depends how early or late the companion is that there are various indications that in the early period, up until around the sort of end of the 7th century CE, and this is even on sort of a traditionalist view, I think there are strong indications of this. So even for like the nuanced traditionalists, I think this is going to be the case. Transmission was anonymous. Things circulated without people recording who they got it from until finally you reach the followers. And the followers are people saying, Abu Huraira said this, but Abu Huraira is not saying where he got it from, right? Or Ibn Abbas or whoever. And there were explicit reports, they use language I wouldn't agree with because I don't think it's like deception, but all these, there are reports mentioning that Abu Huraira used to often do tadlis, a kind of deceptive, not acknowledging his sources, although I don't think it is deceptive because I don't think it was yet a norm. Actually, I don't think it was yet expected. Or Abdullah ibn Omar. These are these sort of very frequently cited transmitters of hadiths in the Sunni corpus. Or Ibn Abbas, only heard 10 hadiths from the Prophet, or there are only 40 hadiths where he indicates his proximity, that he's actually present, etc., etc. So even on sort of a kind of critical traditionalist view, it seems like transmission is largely anonymous. Now, obviously, the traditional presumption is that in most cases, a companion is like a junior companion, like Abu Huraira or whatever, heard this from a senior companion, from another companion. And so there's a theoretical unbroken chain of companions behind all of these extant cited companion sources. And so what this means is that the prophet may never, in some sense, be a common link in a technical sense, in the sense that he's not actually being cited as the common direct source, let's say, by one companion and another companion. They're just saying the prophet said this, and they're not actually saying who they got it from. So it might be that they got it from each other, or that they got it from an earlier uncited common source. We don't know. So the point is that there are special considerations that reflect the specifics of Islamic history that attend to the prophet and to a lesser extent companions that do not apply to later common links, that make them far more difficult to identify as real common links because they are extremely likely to falsely appear as common links. And we basically have no way of identifying when they are a real common link and when they are a false common link.
And quickly,
so that's
you were saying that you can use ICMA to get around this?
Yes, all of that being said, we can still use Isnad-cum-matn analysis, but it requires further methods on top of that. And so that is, and this actually, the proto version of this goes back to Motzki, although I sort of disagree with some of his applications, but the basic idea, I think, actually is right. And this is what I'm sort of trying to develop more and more. And I have sort of a negative case of this in my most recent article on going beyond the common link, but in the case of the hadiths on the canonization of the Quran by Uthman, there's going to be a positive case where I think we can identify genuine material here, genuine memories. And that is, if you reconstruct multiple common link hadiths and then you compare them, so at this point you've reached the termination of Isnad-cum-matn analysis. But you can still compare them textually and see that, okay, well, this version is actually, more elaborate than this version, or this version is elaborate in its own way. And so it seems like they're going off some earlier, simpler form and they're elaborating in different ways. And so you can sort of reasonably infer that there's some kind of earlier material. And so you can, and then you can even go earlier and earlier and earlier, and you don't have exact dates, but you can clearly show that, okay, this is a really early idea. And especially when you then combine that with this is some kind of what we might call, I used to call it form criticism, but it's actually more like a subset of form criticism called tradition criticism or tradition historical criticism or tradition history. And it's about like tracing the evolution of traditions, right? Is the best term for describing this kind of methodology. And so we can then combine that with geographical analysis and show, okay, there's something very early from these common links in one region, and there's something very early, the same thing, a different version of it is also attested early in another region. So it's got to be super early. And so you can do this, for example, with material on Uthman, the canonization of the Quran by Uthman. Also, for example, the Urwa ibn Zubair's report, or early Medinan authority, on the Treaty of Hudaybiyyah, and Abu Ishaq as-Sabili, early Kufan scholars' version, and they're very different. In fact, they're very discrepant, but they're describing the same basic event and they're quoting from the same archaic treaty. And so it seems very plausible, if not probable, that these just go back to some ultra early, either just independent memories or some report that is like from the time. And so if there's just a report about a treaty from like a decade before, what's the easiest explanation for that report? It's just that there was a treaty a decade before. You see what I'm saying? And so, or they are just independent memories of the same event, right? It gets a bit tricky sometimes if it's like super early. And all of this is going to be explored in detail in my part 2 of my Jigsaw series on the canonization of the Quran. Now, it's not foolproof, okay? There are going to be cases where, for example, widespread like early miracle claims, like the idea that when the prophet was born, a light came out of his mother. This is a very widely attested early idea you find in Sunni sources and Shi'i sources and so on. I would, in many cases, we just say it's plausible or even probable that this is just a memory of the prophet or something the prophet said or did or something in the life of the prophet and so on. One final thing I should add with that as well, which just occurred to me, is when you have not just geographical agreement, but what we might call trans-sectarian or pan-Islamic agreement as well. So if you can trace something back early in multiple rival sects, and it's a point that they are unlikely to have borrowed from each other later on, then you can posit as the explanation for that agreement that the thing that they agree on goes back to before they split off as sects, and is in fact some sort of common inheritance, something that they've all inherited in common. So the Uthmanic canonization is an example of this, where they all view it in different ways, all the different sects, and some of them view it very positively, some of them view it very negatively, but they all agree on this basic fact that it was Uthman. Because this is a basic memory that goes back to, or we can posit as a reasonable explanation for this, that this is a basic memory that goes back to before they all split off in the fitna, right? And so they all, as they split through the first fitna and then continuing on after that and more through the second fitna and so on, they're thinking about things in different ways now, but they've all inherited from before even that first fitna this basic background fact that is rooted in just people's general experiences that Uthman canonized the Quran. So this isn't just geographical sort of trans-regional agreement, there's also trans-sectarian agreement as well. This is another way, and again, we have to be careful. Obviously, like miracle stories, it's very easy for them to spread from one sect to another because they're good for every sect, right? They're just good for generally showing Islam is true. So there are limits, but there are definitely going to be cases where also sort of trans-sectarian agreement also plays a role here in being able to identify super early memories, at least from the time of the companions, if not Possibly the time of the Prophet.
So, guys, we just came back from a break. If you're wondering why Delmon's shirt has changed and why the weather has changed, he's not got magic powers. We just went for a break. But we're back, and Joshua Little is still listing his reasons or ways in which we can derive historical data from the Hadith, especially on ways in which we can get beyond the common link.
So just to summarize what we've covered thus far, we've got the secular tradition of chronology and prosopography. We've got what we might call the tribal tradition of genealogy and relationships and things like that. We've got comparative anthropology. We've got inscriptions, early non-Muslim sources. We also have the criterion of dissimilarity. And then even just with hadith, there are various methods that we can use, Isnad-cum-matn analysis, and then in conjunction with tradition, historical criticism and geographical analysis, and also looking at, for example, a sort of trans-sectarian agreement as well to identify early or archaic material, for example, concerning the life and times of the Prophet. Now, there are I should give some serious caveats here. So this is not this doesn't sort of abrogate or alleviate all the problems with the sources, whatever the 21 or the 25 or whatever the number will be by the time you watch this. Those problems still remain, right? And this kind of method, this combined method, probably will not work on most hadiths, right? It'll only be a minority of hadiths where there will even be enough sort of data to get to the point of having the multiple common links, and then fulfilling these other kinds of conditions that allow us to pinpoint an early archaic sort of common source tradition or memory, for example.
Why would you say it doesn't work on most hadith?
I think that most hadiths will not have early common links in multiple regions, for example.
Okay.
So it might be that they don't even have common links, or if they do have common links, they're usually in this region or that region, or even if they are, it could be that they're common links late. For example, if they're late common links in multiple regions, that means a lot less than if they're sort of early common links. Do you see if there's a common link in a region and another region, but it's from the era when people are traveling very frequently between regions, for example, it's a lot less meaningful than if it's someone as early as Ottawa, in Medina, and Abu Ishaq, who's not as early but still quite early in Kufa, for example. Or in the case of the Uthmanic canonization hadith, it's like Ibn Sirin in Basra, quite early, Abu Ishaq in Kufa, Zuhri in Medina and Syria. And so not all hadiths are going to, in fact, probably most hadiths are not going to reach this level of having Isnad-cum-matn analysis verifiable common links who are so early in multiple regions, if that makes sense. So, and even when we can do that, even hadiths that reach that threshold, this is not a kind of blanket tasheeh, right? This is not just saying, oh, they're just, you can just accept. It's like, even with like the Treaty of Hudaybiyyah, Urwa's report is very distorted in various ways. It has all kinds of like miracles and artificial literary features and other kinds of things. Or the hadiths on Uthman are incredibly distorted. I mean, there's a sense in which they're extremely unreliable, actually. They're full of all kinds of discrepancies, contradictions, sectarian twists, you name it.
I do want to say that when you say unreliable, you mean unreliable on its face. Because I sort of imagine it as a scholar could do the work, a scholar could do the legwork to derive historical data from these narrations. In fact, this happens in the tradition as well, right? So traditional scholars will also, when they have multiple variations of a hadith, some scholars will say that the wording in this variant is inauthentic, but in this one it's more authentic. But as you say, I guess it depends on the data, right? How much data they have access to. But yeah, and I guess this goes then into the wider debate as well when it comes to tradition and historical critical method. So one of the points that's brought up, I think, by those who are more sanguine with the hadith is obviously to what extent did the traditional muhaddithin have access to, what data did they have access to that we don't have access to today?
That's an interesting sort of question. I know it'll probably lead us down another
rabbit
tangent, so
hole,
I'll resist there. But there's a very interesting answer to that question. But just to sort of clarify, what I'm saying is that even there are, and I sort of mentioned this previously, but there are hadiths where they have distorted elements and they also have genuine elements. And so what I'm saying is, even in the case of, for example, the reports on Uthman, they are not reliable in toto. Right? They contain distortions of all kinds, but we can identify that the gist, the basic elements some basic propositions reported therein are genuine. And so this is just a caution that this is not the same as saying that, oh, this one is so when the traditional
you could say traditionally speaking their ma'na is correct. Like it's like
even the ma'na is not quite right, because it's not. It's like this part, this part, this part. It won't be even parts of the gist. Sometimes are going to be. It depends on the given case. So it's more about finding authentic elements or kernels recorded in hadiths than it is about saying that this hadith is an accurate report and this version is the khata, right? So this is the erroneous version and this is the correct or true version, and that's not the way that this is happening. This is more like all versions contain some distortions, all versions contain some genuine elements in cases like this, for example, with the Uthmanic canonization. And so this is just an important caveat, is that there's a sense in which even when they are in some sense reliable, they are often or usually in other senses also, or to some degree, unreliable as well. They're sort of mixed in. So it's sort of this is a different way of approaching this, I would say, than is usually the case, for example, in traditional scholarship.
So basically, it's not a silver bullet.
No. But it's still, it's something. I mean, and if we add up all the cases like this, right, even though this won't apply to most hadiths, the hadith corpus is so vast, so much material ended up being sort of transmitted and preserved, that if you add up all the cases like this, I think, and you add up all the authentic data to varying degrees of probability or plausibility that we can extract using these kinds of methods, at the end of that process, I think it'll actually be a large amount of data. So even if I don't think that it'll be necessarily a high resolution picture, here to sort of build on the sort of language that Sean Anthony uses, I think that the picture will be a large picture. So that's the sense in which I think that, for example, I will be able, well, I don't know if I'll be able to pull it off in my lifetime, for example, but I do think that you could probably write a very substantial biography of the Prophet, building off a very large number of authentic kernels and then extrapolating out from that. And so I think that there is a lot of material that we can extract. In that sense, I am optimistic.
Yeah, okay. And of course, if we discover manuscripts or more relevant inscriptions, then we could get an even bigger picture. I mean, it's possible. Okay, perfect.
So you mentioned Urwa earlier, and it's a very popular opinion that's been growing because Sean Anthony recently mentioned the reliability of Urwa's corpus and I guess the proximity to Aisha. I don't know if that's exactly how he would argue it, probably a lot more eloquently than how I'm putting it, but he sees the age of Aisha being authentic due to the reliability and how early Urwa's corpus is. And this is like the most asked question. It's been asked at least 6 times when I said we were doing this interview, but I'd love to know your opinion. It's a big topic, so yeah.
Certainly. This is something I actually cover in my dissertation. So this is a very common thing that people will often ask questions that are already answered in the dissertation, although I know that it's a long dissertation, so in some sense I can understand. So what I'm going to say here is actually you can find a more formalized version of this already in my dissertation. So there are a couple of considerations here when thinking about this. So the first thing is that Urwa is not a common link for the version of the Aisha hadith that is attributed to him. He's cited by Hisham, and in one variant from Hisham, this is the variant of Abd Razak from Ma'mar, there's a co-citation of Az-Zuhri from Urwa, right? Now there are other descriptions to Az-Zuhri as well, although textually they are not coherent, as in the matn, the text of all the different versions attributed to az-Zuhri, each one is more similar to other versions of the material than they are to each other, which means that az-Zuhri cannot be identified as a genuine common link, right? This is what it would look like if there was sort of converging borrowings and misattributions, for example. This is, by the way, a sense in which Isnad-cum-matn analysis is actually falsifiable, is that we know what approximately, or as a generalization, allowing, of course, for the possibility of very subtle cases of false attribution or whatever. We know what both a genuine common link looks like and also a false common link. If you can identify the positive, you have to be able to identify a negative, right? And so other than that, which is uncorroborated from Zuhri, this ascription to Urwa, and it's cited in the tradition of Hisham, right? So there doesn't seem to be any kind of independent transmission from Urwa, independent of his son Hisham, if you see what I'm saying. So, and again, I discussed this in more detail in my dissertation. Okay, so really it's just, there's a single strand, essentially, or there's a single citation of Hisham from his father, again, allowing for this one instance of a uncorroborated co-transmission mentioned in a version of Hisham's hadith, that of Abd al-Razzaq. Okay, so now there is a version of that in this. Hisham transmits several different redactions of his hadith, and in one of them, it's in the form of a letter attributed to his father, between his father and a caliph, although I think there are discrepancies as to which caliph it is, right? Whether it's Abdul Malik or whether it's his son Al-Walid. But okay, so there's a letter, and so it's the letters that, so the fact that Urwa is cited by someone by itself doesn't mean that's completely equivocal, right? The thing that is meant to sort of increase the strength of the tradition is the fact that it's one version of it is attributed as a letter of Urwa's, right? And so independently of Urwa being a common link, some scholars have argued that the letters that are attributed to him are broadly sort of authentic in the sense that they go back to Urwa, and then it's thought, well, because this is an early, a layer of tradition that was recorded in writing early, this adds strength to it in terms of the chances of it preserving authentic information, for example, about the life and times of the Prophet. And to this, Sean Anthony adds two considerations, and this is sort of building on Andreas Gorka's work. So the first is that the letters attributed to Urwa, and again, Urwa is not actually the common link for most of these, right? These are just recorded in later sources attributed back to him via single strands, right? But the letters are, they don't contain lots of elaborations and miracles, right? Which is consistent with them being archaic. So this is one consideration. And the other consideration is that they, for example, they consistently omit Ali. And this is consistent with them being the product of a kind of Zubayrid, Umayyad, Medinan environment, right? Under the Umayyad dynasty, and also reflecting the interests of the Zubayrids, of which a family that sort of had a bid for political power at one point, that Urwa is part of, right? So that's consistent. So in short, the material is consistent with being, in general, early and from Urwa. Right? This is the argument. Now, there are some problems with this. The first one is that the Zubayrid Umayyad thing, this applies equally to Hisham and to az-Zuhri, the two main transmitters of the letters from Urwa. Az-Zuhri was a great student of Urwa's, so he's connected to the Zubayrids, and he works for the Umayyads. He's an official in the Umayyad government. The same is for Hisham. Hisham is living under the Umayyads for most of his life, and he's a Zubayrid. So that consideration is actually quite equivocal, because it could apply to Urwa, but it could also apply to the people in the generation after Urwa, right? So I would say that consideration is not definitive, if you see what I'm saying. The other thing is that the lack of miracles could just be explained by genre. I mean, these are meant to be private letters to a caliph, not sort of traditions being taught to students in like a pious or edifying context, for example. So it might just be that the genre accounts for the fact that these stories aren't full of miracles, for example. So these are two sort of caveats around these kinds of arguments for the sort of general sort of reliability. The other thing is that they are letters. I mean, their genre, or their form, I should say, is that of a letter, but they were not transmitted in writing. These are hadiths. They were transmitted orally and paraphrastically. And in fact, even in the sort of the co-transmissions from Hisham, who's the common link for one version, for example, the version that has to do with the marriage of Aisha, there are massive discrepancies and variation in the level of entire elements and lots of wordings in the co-transmissions, even just from Hisham, let alone who knows how much variation occurred in the transmission, say, from Urwa to Hisham or Urwa to Az-Zuhri. So this is a huge confounding factor. So I'm very cautious about, I'm not saying that some of the letters are not authentic or that the letters don't contain authentic information, but I would be very cautious about just sort of doing a kind of blanket tashih on the letters and saying, well, if a letter is attributed to Urwa, then it goes back to him. And if it goes back to him, it goes back to him fully in its extant form. And if it goes back to him fully in its extant form, it's just generally or entirely reliable, if you see what I'm saying. So in fact, we can see clearly that the letters were altered in the course of transmission subsequent to Urwa. And so I would say that therefore the mere fact that the Aisha marital element ends up in a letter by itself is not at all definitive, right? This is equivocal. It could mean that it was part of the original letter from Urwa, or it could be that it was added later, or it could be the entire letter was created later. There are a number of scenarios and so there are just all these sort of confounding factors that make this not at all definitive evidence, in my opinion. And so you then have to look at other considerations. And that's when I look at the sort of the general absence of the Aisha hadith from the earliest sort of layer of Medina material, and so on. And so then you look at other factors as well, and then it seems like, okay, actually, this is probably coming from Hisham. But I think that the idea that the Aisha hadith is earlier than Hisham, I don't think that's a crazy idea. I just think that it's not the best explanation for the evidence that we currently have. So but I do think that, so I wouldn't agree with Sean on that, though.
Yeah. Okay, so that was another thing when we were sort of looking at the tradition and the historical critical method approach to hadith. That was another topic we mentioned, and it comes up in your 21 Reasons, which is the notion of miracles. Now, there's two things I want to say on the miracles, and it relates to this concept of mutawatir. So for those who don't know, mutawatir is a report that has been reported so much, that is so widespread, that scholars say that it's very, it's implausible, near impossible for it to have been fabricated by someone. In other words, it could be something like the prophet's a common link, right? The prophet's a common link, and he told 10, 20, 30 people, and then they told lots of people. So many people are saying this that it's impossible that they could have lied. Now, I wanted to get your thoughts on that and whether mutawatir can be a method in which we can gain historical data. But it also relates to what you say about miracles. Now, of course, historical critical scholars have different views on miracles, but of course many miracles in Islam, definitely miracles depend on the existence of God and God acting in a certain way. So of course the historical critical method suspends assumptions about God, so it's difficult to have miracles. However, I wanted to just point this out for the audience's benefit, because lots of people sort of think about the tradition and the historical critical method, and of course you can give your views on this as well. But obviously some of the miracle claims are supposed to be mutawatir, right? Or at least mutawatir in meaning. Like one of them is supposed to be like the prophet having water coming out of his fingers. Now, one of your claims was that in the Javad Hashmi video was philosophical. It was the idea that, well, a miracle, even on a secular basis, we shouldn't believe it because it's so improbable that there's no amount of testimony that could make us believe it. Or you said that there is testimony, but it should be like from scientists or something like that. But of course, and we spoke about this off air, the whole concept, even scientific evidence, comes down to testimony, right? So testimony is sort of the epistemic engine here. And so I think it's interesting that Islamic scholars as well sort of recognize that if you have enough testimony, it can overcome what we call the kharqul ada, the break-in habit, the break-in in the laws that we're used to seeing. If you have enough testimony, like hundreds of people have seen something, then we ought to believe it, even if it sort of challenges our understanding of natural law, especially when it's coupled with a pious prophet claiming one God, a plausible theology and stuff like that. That's more of a claim. You can respond to that if you like, but the question, of course, so there's that. So you can respond to that if you like.
Sure.
But the question, of course, that I wanted to ask was just generally about mutawatir, because mutawatir is not just related to miracles. There are mutawatir reports, for example, the Prophet saying that whoever lies about me should take his seat in hellfire. What do you think of mutawatir? Because on the surface, it seems like it can get away with the issue. You can get around the issues because there's so many reports, so much data.
Okay, so instantly or immediately, we have to be careful with the concept of mutawatir because people give the example of the existence of China. This is an example of general tawatur, of general sort of widespread circulation of information about a place that's so the testimony or the evidence is so voluminous that you couldn't doubt that China exists, for example. Okay, so that's one sense. But then the other sense is a narrower sense that's applied to hadith. And that is hadiths that have lots of parallel isnads. And so, I would want to sharply distinguish those two.
Yeah.
So
we can say one is epistemic, one is about hadith. So one is just the epistemic testimony.
Well, it's just a matter of quantity. Like the quantity of evidence for the existence of China is like I don't know, like billions of discrete points of information that are constantly being reinforced everywhere all the time. I want to put that in a different category from we have 10 parallel single-strand isnads, that are from an oral tradition. So but that doesn't mean that in principle this couldn't work with hadith. I just want to acknowledge that tawatur is being used on these two different scales, right? Okay, so when we focus on hadith, so to the degree that tawatur tracks what I mentioned before about having multiple common links in different regions, then there will be some hadiths that are called mutawatir and that I also think will be in some sense traceable back to the early period, even to the Prophet, or being rooted in genuine memories of the Prophet, or the companions, or what have you. If to the degree that mutawatir lines up with that, then that sort of checks out. But I think actually in a lot of cases this is not going to be so, and that's because I think that what is actually being tracked, and again we come to the tricky issue of what counts as mutawatir. How many parallel isnads do you need, right? As being how many isnads do they have to be so that there's so many independent people in every generation? Obviously there are different lists, but I think most of the time it's just going to end up tracking that there are multiple single strands, right? Even if it's like there are 4 or 5 or 10 parallel single strands, and then even then, what are they really sort of carrying? Is it actually the same exact statement, or are they just sort of on the same topic? So probably
you accept that the more number you have, the more plausible it is, because even traditional scholars don't agree on an exact number. But then they say that mutawatir doesn't need an exact number. It's just the notion that once information becomes widespread, you have a higher level of credence rather than.
I don't know if I agree with that. Yeah, I understand, but the difficulty is that a genuine memory could survive in isolation, or a false idea could very easily proliferate and spread around given the conditions of early Islamic history. Mentioned previously.
Traditionally, that would have been mutawatir.
What I'm saying is that it would then. No. What I'm saying is that. Oh, sorry, you go.
No, because we're talking about a case where mutawatir generally, according to traditional scholars about the Prophet, is coming from the companions' time, like it's mutawatir in the time of the companions.
What I'm saying though is that, are you describing something theoretical that happened, or are you describing something that in terms of the surviving hadith evidence? So what I'm saying is that the surviving hadith evidence is that we usually have a series of parallel single strands that seem to reach all the way, for example, back to the Prophet. And what I'm saying is that if in that case, we have the difficulty of, sure, there are these parallel single strands and there appears to be multiple independent attestation all the way back to the Prophet. But we know that early on, that irsal, people not citing their sources, was actually very widespread. We know that tadlis, people dishonestly, deliberately not citing.
That wouldn't be that's not what I'm asking. It seems like you agree. It seems like you agree, because this would be something like the fact that the Prophet married Aisha is actually a mutawatir fact. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah. Okay. That I think is right. So, but this is Okay, so this is very interesting. This is a good point. So there are things that are mutawatir in the sense that it's like a basic hadith, and there are different versions of that hadith that
Yeah.
are have there's multiple isnads for it, and that is not going to cut much ice with me in and of itself. It has to fulfill
Yeah.
the more specific criteria that I already mentioned. So in that sense of hadiths, mutawatir hadiths, I don't think mutawatir is going to be very useful for the sort of work that I'm doing or that secular scholars are doing. But if something is a basic fact that is deeply embedded in all kinds of hadiths, this is going to move me. However, the key thing there is that this is something, and this is what I say actually, for example, in an unpublished article, which hopefully will come out eventually. This is how I start the article. There can be little doubt that Aisha was married to Muhammad, right? This is a fact that's attested in all kinds of material, in all kinds of sources, from all sects, from all regions, if you see what I'm saying. So, but the key thing there, in a sense,
Yeah.
but you'll notice that it's trans-sectarian and sort of trans-regional agreement for me is the key there. If it was merely something that was confined to only one sect's traditions or one region's traditions, I would be far less likely to accept it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So you agree then? Yeah. So you do agree. Because then that wouldn't be mutawatir if it was just confined to one sect.
Okay.
But this is things like. But I think that a clear example of this is like that scholars give is related to rituals, like the fact that the Prophet, where did he put his hands during prayer? Everybody agrees that, and Melchett actually said this. No one says that he put his hands up here, right? It's always it's either going to be the navel, below the navel, maybe he put it as his sides. But the fact that his hands were not up there, or the fact that something was recited during the prayer time, or that the prayer time has times, or that there's a standing part to the prayer, or the Quran in meaning. These are all facts that I would say that the historical critical method and the tradition agree that in theory mutawatir is plausible historical. Like, it can be made a plausible historical case.
I think that but the thing is that I wouldn't use the term mutawatir, just because it will. What most people actually think of are hadiths with many isnads, and that's not really what.
Well, that would be.
That's not the factor that I'm tracking.
Yeah,
the thing I'm tracking is things like trans-sectarian agreement and so on, or interregional agreement. Yeah.
I think you said something interesting earlier in the interview where you said these miracle, I guess this mass transmission of these miracle narratives are convenient for all sects. Like this is a thing that could easily be sectarian, because it's a truth claim about a religion you believe in, a new one at that. You know what I mean? So there feels this incentive to fulfill these miracle claims to match, I guess, like a Jesus or a Moses type figure. So I found that interesting. So I was wondering if we could really get into this, because as Ahmed has pointed out, it might be a philosophically contested area to discuss this.
So the basic idea, or the basic sort of criticism or critical approach that I advocate when it comes to the issue of miracles, and there are others as well. I'm sort of building here off, for example, Arif Ahmed and Richard Carrier and these kinds of thinkers when it comes to the issue of miracles. The idea is that what is very, very likely to explain reports of miracles is some kind of false creation, or anything other than that there was actually a miracle that occurred. That's the idea. So it's not an a priori denial of the possibility of the occurrence of miracles. It's a point about the overwhelming prior probability of false creation of some kind as the explanation for reports of miracles. And I think that this actually applies even if you believe in God and even if you believe in miracles, right? So you sort of can sort of derive this from even the sort of general discussions of the Hadith scholars, where they talk about, Hadith were mass fabricated, and they think Hadith were mass fabricated. Thousands and thousands of false Hadiths, were created according to the Hadith critics, the early Sunni Hadith critics. And one of the classic categories of Hadiths that are being falsely created are edifying Hadiths, and also Hadiths for like popular consumption. So these are hadiths that are being fabricated by zuhad, sort of pious kind of renunciants, and these kinds of people, the salihin, the sort of pious people, and also the qusas, the kind of street preachers. And so, and you know, they're creating these sort of wonderful and miraculous kinds of tales and so on. And so even, but not just miracle stories, but one of the classic things that are being created here are miracle stories. So even from a traditional perspective, miracle stories were mass fabricated. And so, and this is, I think, probably most people would agree in general, although it's not like you could say like the devil is doing it, for example, when it comes to rival religions. But I think most people would agree that stories of miracles across history and in religious contexts have been largely falsely created, right? You know, by various kinds of mechanisms. And certainly in the case of hadith in particular. And so this is the argument. It's not sort of an a priori rejection. Now, how much testimony would be required to shift that? From me at this point, given sort of the last 300 years of sort of global scientific exploration that has resulted in sort of no documentation of the things that we refer to as miracles, say like jinn or, I don't know, talking trees or people's heads being miraculously sort of reattached after decapitation or levitation or what have you, right? There are all kinds of things that we sort of all sort of broadly familiar with as the things that we mean by miracles. Because there has been sort of no empirical scientific sort of verification of anything like this in all of modern science, and because there is this overwhelming tendency for people to falsely create these kinds of stories, at this point, I would require stronger evidence than testimony. Because in other words, what it currently looks like is that these kinds of things, including, for example, jinn, are not products of the world, they're products of minds. That's what it looks like, right? Because there are all these stories and experiences, but there's no evidence. There's no empirical evidence. I mean, obviously testimony is a kind of evidence, but there's no empirical evidence or any kind of scientific evidence. And so that's what it would look like if this is a kind of like a psychological event of some kind, or a product of human mind, social product, a cultural product, not something that actually exists in the world, if you see what I'm saying. And so I'm not denying the possibility that these things exist in the world. And in fact, I'd be thrilled, right? If people could levitate or there were jinn. I mean, you know, I'm here for it. I'm here for it. Let's Bigfoot, Atlantis. I want to live in that world.
But the issue is it's no longer a miracle, right? If it had a scientific explanation, it would be a miracle. The point is that it's a divine.
No. I'm not saying that it's explainable. I'm just saying that it can be empirically documented, which is not the same thing. You can imagine a world.
But testimony is
in which
a form of empirical documentation.
No, and testimony is just testimony. Empirical documentation would be some kind of physical evidence of the existence of these things.
If you look at scientific experiments, well, let's go back to you've never been to the US, right?
Sure.
Delman can tell you that empirically the US exists. Like he looks around and then you see the Capitol Hill and you can see
sure.
Testimony itself, you're right, is not an empirical epistemic source, but it is empirical documentation. Like you can, when a scientist sees something, they document it down on a note, and then that becomes testimony.
Sure.
Yeah. In this case, it would be like.
I think though that the scientist, you know, conducting tests in a laboratory as a professional, who is then immediately noting down their results in unperishable documentation, there's a tiny possibility there for a wild delusion to suddenly take hold or some sort of chronic error. That is possible, but I would say that the error there is minuscule compared to just people out in the world going off just memory, oral tradition. This is a galaxy apart from each other. And the thing about the scientific results is that they can always or usually be replicated, or it's based on something physical that can then other scientists can come and constantly verify. This is not the case with miracle claims, where it's just something that in someone's memory somewhere, if you see what I'm saying. And so at this point,
I would if you look at something like Hannibal crossed the Alps with elephants, which has never been done before, right? So the prior probability is quite low. It's also intrinsically very improbable. It's a difficult task to do. I don't think anyone's done it after him. What do we have? It's mutawatir testimony, right? That he did that.
I don't even know if it's mutawatir. It might, but maybe we could.
If we take the definition we talked about before, that there's so many different. I mean, if it's not even mutawatir, then that puts a standard even lower.
That's what I'm saying. But in the case there, actually, I think that there isn't a
It
specific
is
tradition. No, it's not even about scientifically possible. The point is just that the sort of thing that he's doing, people do sort of take armies and cross over from one, do crossings over a body of water. People do try and invade. Like, these are all things that have been established many times, including in modern
But what about
history.
the first time it happened? What about the first time it happened? The
first time it happened. The other thing is that there's not a specific. Sure. This is always possible. It's always possible there's going to be some things that we have reason to doubt at first, and then over time, we have to update our evidence. That is, everyone is in that situation, right? But there isn't a specific tradition of people falsely creating stories of guys gathering an army to cross the river to do a surprise attack on Rome from the north. So I would say I would say that it's very disanalogous to the case of
but I do think
miracles and so on.
I see what you're saying, but your point here, I think, would be weakened by a new religious movement. So when someone moves from a state, so if you're talking about an environment in which already people already believe, so they already have an agenda, they're already attached to the religion and stuff like that. But when you have a founder of a completely new religion and there's a hostility towards that religion, people actually have the opposite. They have the reason to deny these, and yet. So, like, take the resurrection of Jesus, for example. Christian philosophers will say, well, there was no need for people to move from a state of disbelief to belief. Like, there's no tradition there. The tradition's forming still, if that makes sense. Like,
I'll give you
another example. When the Prophet Muhammad came, he was in Mecca. People didn't like his message. The majority of people didn't like his message. And, like, let's say that there was a miracle ascribed to him, and let's say 100 people believed it, and then they told another 100 people and stuff like that, and then it was documented, right? When you say that there's a motive of that tradition to make that up, I would argue there isn't. In this case, there isn't, because nobody believes in the Prophet yet, and then they come to believe in that because of that miracle.
You're saying people at the time. You're saying, so the first thing is that we're usually not even at that point. So what the false creation is normally happening later on, retrospectively, not at the time. So this wouldn't even come up in most cases. That being said, even in new religious
do you believe in theory? Do you believe?
Not really. Because even in new religious movements, miracle claims are ubiquitous. There seem to be a sort of standard part of the emergence of new religious movements, and also charismatic kind of revival or mystical, or there are different kinds, sub-movements that emerge even within existing religions. The emergence of a new sect or a new religion is very often involves a founding figure who then, even at the time, is accompanied by all kinds of stories and accounts of miracles. So I think that it's just a normal part of the emergence of religions. So I don't think that this new member of religion
you'd have to look case by
just
case.
as motivated. Sure, maybe, but in general, new members of religion seem to be just as motivated for there to be miracles verifying and validating their new belief as people who were born into a religion retrospectively looking back, say 100 years.
Not if the miracle is the reason that made them believe. That's what I'm trying to point out.
Okay.
Yeah.
This gets more interesting because we do have cases of people who are initially hostile, who then experience cognitive dissonance.
That's what I'm trying to get at.
Something like a miracle then helps to resolve the cognitive dissonance. So even there, I think we have a kind of standard, kind of known kind of psychological mechanism that would actually account for that without having to then violate the overwhelming prior probability of false creation of some kind or misperception of some kind as the explanation for people's reports of miracles.
Okay. Well, we can continue the discussion.
I really enjoyed that.
I mean, I don't think I'm not sure. I mean, this is me speaking philosophically, not like historically. But I don't know if there is an adequate psychological framework. I still think that it's still up in the air. Okay. But so Joshua, you've told me before that you love the tradition. I was going to say you do love the tradition as well, but you also love the madrasa. There's the madrasa system. You told me this before, that if you had an option, well, I don't think you said you love it, but you said that if you had the option, you would like to study in it. If you had
there's a caveat there. I did say that. Well, what I said, I think, is that I wished I'd gone through a madrasa. And there's a sense in which that's true, but it does require caveats. So the thing that I like about a madrasa would be that you're fully immersed and dedicated to just, for example, no, it's not just hadith, you'd be learning the full suite of disciplines, but that you're just fully immersed in studying the religion. And that seems very appealing to me. And you get such a deep sort of familiarity with language, sources, tradition. And so that's a very sort of strong foundation. And you can see that some of the greatest scholars now in our field, like Saqib Hussein or Haytham Sidki, are, they're combining traditional training with critical methods. And it seems like an extremely fruitful kind of synthesis, right? So I think that there are definitely advantages there. And so that is appealing. I will say, though, probably the reverential side of being in a madrasa is probably something that I would probably be ill-suited to.
Of course.
So there's a caveat there, but there definitely is an appeal, and there's definitely are advantages.
But in light of that, we wanted to ask you, what's your favorite school of law, and do you have a favorite scholar? And we can end on that, and why?
Because the only thing is that I don't know if I have a favorite. I don't know what I would. I don't know how I would choose.
I'll do one better. What do you like about each tradition? How about that?
I like the systematicity of Abu Hanifa. So I haven't sort of studied him in any kind of depth at all, but there have been some cases where I've sort of looked into the origins or development of this or that legal issue, and sort of mostly based on hadith, and sort of reconstructing the development of sort of the material on a given legal issue. And I did notice that Abu Hanifa stood out as a clearly early systematic thinker in this regard, right? He really did seem different from other people, where he is sort of deriving things in a very logical and systematic way, like, well, based on this hadith, and this must be wrong, and this must be. He just really stood out to me, actually, as a very sort of system, and I like that. I like that kind of. I like the logical consistency. I like, okay, if you're committed to this here, then that has this implication over here. And so that is very appealing. And so the Hanafi tradition has this very strong foundation of logical, systematic argumentation. And I like that. The Maliki school has the allure of the city of the Prophet and the collective custom, the amal of the people of Medina. And that's a sort of, I guess, like an appealing concept as well, right? Like just sort of thinking sort of intra-Islamically or in an intra-Sunni sense, that's sort of a powerful consideration, right? That we're going off the continuous collective communal practice of the people of the city of the Prophet, right? Then there's the Shafi'i tradition, and this one is interesting because in one sense you could say it falls between two stools, or on the other sense you could say that it combines strengths from rival traditions, that being the hadith tradition and the sort of rationalist and sort of legalist kind of tradition, which was sort of originally antithetical. And so you could either say, well, they're not as sort of systematic as the Hanafis, and they're not as hadith oriented as the Hanbalis, or you could say they combine both. They combine the strong anchor of hadith with rational methods, right? So maybe that's the positive way to look at it. And finally, the Hanbalis have the appeal of being extremely hadith oriented, the most sort of hadith oriented in terms of, look, we're not sort of going to introduce our own sort of fallible reasoning, or we're going to try and minimize that as much as possible. And we're just going to focus as much as possible on what do hadiths say. And that has its own appeal, although maybe in the modern period, obviously over time, a Hanafi school did grow and the set of precedents did grow. And so now that their appeal you can find maybe more strongly in Salafism, and so maybe that the Hanbalis are sort of outstripped there by the Salafis, who have the sort of do-it-yourself appeal of we're just here with the sources, unmediated. Of course, everything goes to the mediation of the mind and interpretation and so on. So, but at least in terms of the appeal, you don't have to study this vast tradition. Here are just the direct divine or inspired sources. Of course, there is a danger there I mean, there's the maybe the advantage of having a vast sort of legal tradition is that inconsistencies have been sort of tackled for generation after generation. So, right, and also it's been stress tested over the generations for all kinds of problems and solutions. So there's a way in which there's an inherent advantage to belonging to a tradition rather than doing it yourself. But if you're extremely sort of, I don't know, have an extreme kind of Protestant orientation and you just want direct access to the sources, then obviously Salafism will have that appeal as well. In terms of which one I like the most, or I find the most appealing in terms of these kinds of, I don't know, like almost like intra-Islamic considerations or even aesthetic considerations, who can say?
Well, you said Hanafi to me before. I'm just saying.
Oh no, okay. I will say, okay.
I had to put it out there just to out you.
Okay,
Already.
but well, I think there is something appealing about the Hanafism, but I think I'm much more interested in early Hanafism, not the sort of later Hadith-oriented form of Hanafism.
Yeah.
But I also, okay, I'll tell you what. Here, I'll be honest. It comes down to Malikism and Hanafism.
Yeah, of course.
So
That's
those are
right. Yeah.
yeah.
Makes sense. Yeah. I mean, that's
Yeah.
how it is for me as well. It was either going to be one of those two, but I just like, as you
Yeah,
said,
that's how
I like Abu Hanifa the most. But anyways, thank you very much, Dr. Joshua Little, for joining us this fairly our longest podcast yet. So it's been very enjoyable. We've covered, we've had a lot of topics covered, and hopefully we'll have you on again. So thank you very much.
No worries. Thank you very much for having me.